Josiah Pierce, a career Foreign Service officer, is currently serving as Vice-Consul at the United States Embassy in Bogota, Colombia. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, Pierce was an attorney in Boston. He received a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Brigham Young University and a JD from Northeastern University School of Law. Pierce and his wife Tricia Smith Pierce are the parents of two young children who I understand will be joining us later. Tricia will be participating at the 3 o'clock presentation, which is Insights into a Career in the Foreign Service, which I think will be very helpful and useful in answering questions and getting two different perspectives on the career in the Foreign Service. We're pleased to have Josiah Pierce speaking on Colombia, Desperation and Immigration. I trust he's going to further elucidate that title. Please join me in welcoming Josiah Pierce.
It's great to be back here at BYU. Like was just said, I'm a BYU graduate, and my wife is too. And some of the happiest times of our life were actually spent here in Provo. Let me just break down my basic structure of what I had in mind for today. I have some prepared remarks, and then basically story time with Uncle Joe, things that I've seen in Colombia, and then finish up with some more prepared remarks. I invite you to ask questions and warn you that if you're in my prepared time, I might ignore you so I don't get completely thrown off kilter. And when you ask questions, I'd prefer not to address career-oriented questions here, but those will be better served at the 3 o'clock meeting, and I think mostly because I think my wife will have a lot to add to any questions you might ask. So I want to start by asking how many of you have ever been trapped underwater, either pulled under by a wave, stuck under a dock, or in my case, held under by an older brother. That's the feeling of desperation that I want you to have in the backs of your minds as I talk today. The overwhelming feeling of a desire to get at something. In the case of being underwater, the desire to be in somewhere where you can breathe, to get oxygen, and the question of whether or not you will ever be able to breathe again. For a number of reasons, that's how Colombia is. For many people, Colombia is a very desperate place. Their desperation is just as real as the desperation that some of us have had trying to get out of water and get to air. One solution that a lot of people see is to move to other countries to fulfill what they see as their dream, or just to have a sustainable life. Those other countries include, and mostly are basically, the United States. A lot of people come here legally, either through an immigrant visa or a visa that allows you to work or go to school, a work visa, or a student visa. But there is a large number of people who decide to immigrate illegally because they don't have what they see as legal options. Most of the time they either go through Mexico, or more popularly, they obtain a tourist visa and go to the United States. Once they're here in the United States, they simply, in their minds, convert their tourist visa to an immigrant visa, stay, work, and live their lives. So a quick overview of visa law. It's kind of a confusing thing, especially in the American mindset of innocent until proven guilty. My job as a Vice-Consul is to enforce these visa laws, and anyone who wants to get a visa to come to the United States has to be interviewed by a Vice-Consul, by someone like me, to make sure that they meet the requirements. The most popular type of visa interview that we do is a B1, B2 visa, or a visa for business and pleasure, or more commonly known as a tourist visa. Anyone who presents himself at the embassy seeking one of these visas needs to satisfy the interviewing Vice-Consul that they are not an intending immigrant. There's a conflict between innocent until proven guilty. The pre-assumption that anybody who comes for a visa wants to live in the United States and wants to immigrate there. What you need to do to show this is show the Vice-Consul that you're simply going on vacation or to conduct business in the United States. To do this, applicants need to show that they have cultural, familial, work, and social ties to a country that's not the United States. In the case of the people that I interview every day, that means Colombia. And these links are shown by showing that you have a good job, children, grandchildren, property, or any other responsibilities that will compel you to return to Colombia. You don't need all of those things, but there's some combination that we look for. And in order to prove this, whether or not it's true, applicants will go to all ends. One indicator of the desperation in Colombia is our fraud rates. Compared to most other visa posts, the fraud in Colombia is both very high volume and very sophisticated. To compare and contrast something, I did a short TDY in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where they had a fraud section that was run by one Foreign Service national employee and had a part-time vice-consul assigned to it. In Bogota, we have 3 full-time Foreign Service nationals who investigate fraud, a member of our diplomatic security corps who also investigates, a full-time fraud prevention manager, and a full-time vice-consul assigned there on a rotating basis. Since January, we've uncovered 3 major fraud rings, and excluding these rings, we have some other interesting statistics. 28% of all documents checked by the fraud prevention unit in Bogota turned out to be false. 23% of employment documents were false. 44% of checks run through immigration authorities. Most often this is somebody will get a fake passport stamp. 44% of those were false, which means that somebody will leave, overstay in the United States, usually to work, come back, and when they come back, will usually bribe the immigration official to get a backdated entry stamp. And 42% of bank documents prove to be false. These numbers don't include the documents that are obviously false that we see every day. Somebody passes through a bank document, and a lot of the times, the vice-consul can immediately spot it as false. In other cases, families have come in to show that they have a familial tie to Colombia. In one case, I interviewed one of these couples with our fraud prevention manager. I was in one of the visa windows, and he was in the other. And they couldn't answer simple questions. Either that, or they do a lot of different things. They didn't know where they went on their honeymoon. He didn't know, couldn't correspond with what they got each other for Christmas last year, or what color the curtains are in their home. These are questions that even I can know the answer to in my relationship. And I think most husbands should be able to know the answers to even. It turns out that they were never really married. They came in because one of them had a good job and could get the other one to the United States. There's also an economic desperation in Colombia. Around 1999, Colombia suffered a number of economic setbacks. The price of coffee, which is Colombia's chief agricultural export, fell through the floor. The peso was devalued, and there was a tremendous earthquake in the city of Armenia, which is one of the cities in coffee country. One of the indicators of this desperation is how much money people are sending back to Colombia, either through banks or through places like Western Union. In terms of money sent back, Colombia ranks number 3 in Latin America. The 2 countries that are in front of it are Mexico and Brazil. In 2005, $3.3 billion US were sent to Colombia from foreign countries. To put things in perspective, that amount in 2005 equaled 33% of foreign direct investment in Colombia. It also equaled 60% of petroleum exports, 128% of coal exports, and 225% of coffee exports. Using these figures, Colombians working abroad, either legally or illegally, is the country's 2nd largest export. Most of this money comes from the United States, or the greatest percentage comes from the United States. More than 48% of the money comes from the United States, and around 34% comes from Spain. 70% of the remittances, or the money sent back from Colombia, is generated in 3 states: New York, New Jersey, and Florida. These figures show the concentration of Colombian immigrants, illegal and legal, in the greater New York City and Miami metropolitan areas. More than half of the money coming from overseas to Colombia goes to 2 areas: the Pacific Coast or coffee country. The breakdown for that essentially means it goes to coffee country the way that the political geographic setup of Colombia is worked. 85% of the people who receive this money have a high school diploma, and nearly 1/3 have a university degree. 56% of the money goes to women, and 68% of the money is used for daily living expenses. So this isn't money that's being sent back to start a business, to send a kid to school, or to save. A recent news report in one of the major Colombian magazines cited that the city of Pereira, a major city in coffee country, has, in those families, 16% of them have at least one member of their family living abroad. Well, the remittances or money sent back to Colombia are one good indicator. It becomes obvious when you're there that Colombia is not a wealthy country. The woman who works in my home in Bogota is considered by the government to be middle class. She has no hot water in her home. Her 2 children have to share a bed because they don't have money to either get 2 beds and move to a larger apartment. Many Colombians see working overseas, particularly in the United States and Spain, as a way out of this desperation. Another fact that leads to increased immigration from Colombia is the security situation. When we as Americans talk about a civil war, it's a distant memory that not even our grandparents remember. In Colombia, the civil war is going on now. The padres, the guerrillas, and the government are currently involved in this war. What started out as a war between liberals and conservatives has morphed into something worse as the sides now finance their operations using drug money and get involved in the major drug cartels. Many wealthy and prominent people left Colombia around the year 2000 when things got particularly bad. As embassy employees, we live in some of the nicer neighborhoods of Bogota. Most of these apartment buildings that we lived in were empty or virtually empty around this time. For foreign service purposes, around 2000, Bogota was considered dangerous enough to not allow family members to go there. We also get paid more to go there, and at that time got paid even more. Normally, in a situation where somebody wants to declare political asylum, they have to show that they are being persecuted unjustly by their government, or that they have a credible fear of this persecution. An exception has been carved out for Colombia in the United States, that people who feel threatened by groups like the FARC, ELN, and AUC may make these claims. Many of these claims were made around 2000, and as we take into account somebody's past behavior in issuing or not issuing a visa, we take into account when they declared political asylum, since that's an indicator that they might want to stay in the United States. So now we're breaking into the section that I like to call story time with Uncle Joe. Instead of simply giving you a display of facts and figures, I thought it would make more sense if I were to come and share with you the view that I get every day from my window. As you might imagine, there are almost 30 Americans working in our section. So one thing that happens is everybody gets a nickname. One of our current vice-consuls who's working in the immigrant visa section is nicknamed the homewrecker. This isn't because of her personal involvement with people in Colombia, but you can be guaranteed that if she asks for a DNA test, something that she does about once a week, she's going to find out that one member of the family that's presenting themselves to her will not be going to the United States because there isn't the requisite blood relationship. I talked with one man who is ineligible for a visa. If you've ever applied for a visa or gone to see what goes on in one of our consulates, you'll notice that everybody has a computer. And one of the things that happens as people apply is we run name checks on them. One of the people who gave me one of those moments where I needed to make sure that my embassy badge was tucked into my pocket so he couldn't see who I was, couldn't get my name, was ineligible for a visa because he had been a member of the FARC. He had actually been one of those people out in the jungle fighting against the government. Over the course of 1 week, I met a number of people that crossed the border from Mexico to the United States. This is something that I'd never really experienced, at least in Colombia. When I talked to the people, they would have on their visa applications that they had lived in the United States, usually for about a year or two. But on the back of the application, they would never have that they applied for a visa. The first time this happened, I thought that the person was mistaken, so I asked him what kind of visa he had, and he just looked at me and said, "Why would I have a visa? I just went through Mexico." So that happened a few times in a week, and it slowed down for me a bit. A lot of people, when they get deported, even if they're Colombian, will claim that they're Mexican to be sent to the shortest spot to cross back into the United States. That was something else that I didn't really believe until I met somebody who'd done it. He got caught by immigration in the United States, and when they asked, "Where are you from? What's your nationality?" he said, "Well, I'm Mexican. Of course, I speak Spanish." And they said, okay, we'll send you back to Mexico. He was back in the United States in about a month. Speaking of the time in 2000 when everybody was essentially fleeing Colombia, we've seen letters that people have brought in that are signed. They're demand letters for money, and with threats on these people's lives. They're signed, sincerely, the FARC, which is kind of a morbid thing if you think about it, that you get a letter threatening your family and yourself, everything that you own, and have it signed in a professional way. The FARC, by the way, does have quite a professional website, too, if you want to look at that. I don't look at it on my computer in Colombia or my work computer because I don't really want anybody thinking that that's where I spend most of my time. The FARC also has the ability to stop people at checkpoints, ask for their national IDs, and run everybody through a laptop to computer to see how much they paid in taxes and how much money they have in the bank. By doing this, they can deem what they feel is an appropriate amount to extort these people. One of the name checks that I ran recently was for a woman, and it came back that the FBI had information on her. She really wasn't that good a visa applicant, but I really wanted to know what she had done. After going back and forth with her and saying, have you ever been arrested? Have you ever had your fingerprints taken? Has anybody ever taken you into custody? And finally having to say, what happened in 1987? She simply said, I did something very bad. I decided to get a little bit more direct with her and simply asked, did you transport drugs for someone? She bowed her head and simply said that she had. I was talking with one of the students here about a visit that I had. He served a mission in Cali, Colombia. One time, as Vice-Consuls, one of the things that we get to do is to go visit Americans who are imprisoned in foreign countries. The purpose of this is to make sure that they're being treated fairly and in accordance with international law. I visited with 4 men in Cali. Each of them had been arrested for transporting drugs. One of them stuck out in my mind. He's a father of 2 from New York City. He's half Colombian and had been honorably discharged from the United States Marine Corps. He'd carried heroin in his stomach and was trying to get out of Cali to go to Miami. He was told that the airport was rigged, that he'd have no problem, and that everything would go fine. It turns out that the people who told him that the airport was rigged didn't take the time to actually rig the airport, and he was caught. He was serving, I think it was 8 years for what he had done. And one of the things that sticks out about this man for me was his looking at me and saying, things get bad, but in your life, don't ever let them get this bad. All 3 of the men, including one who's suffering from Crohn's disease and gets to stay in one of the fine penal institutions in Colombia, had admitted what they had done to me and were simply hoping that the government of Colombia would have mercy on them. In Colombia, I told you a little bit about our fraud unit, but we have something else that's interesting. We have one officer who's dedicated strictly to visa-related drug and money laundering offenses. He's probably the officer that works the most in our section. We also have a friend who told us that one time his father owns a home in Bogota, but many wealthy Colombians will also own a small farm outside of the city. This happens all over the country. His father's maid was at the farm one day when the FARC came to take him away. He wasn't there, and luckily for her, they simply left. This same friend told us that he was driving in the mountains of Bogota. Bogota is built onto the Andes Mountains. He was driving in the mountains getting to a friend's house, and 2 men stood out in front of him. He ran one of them over. He said, I know that I broke his legs, but I had to figure that it was him or it was me. One night coming home from the ambassador's residence is one of the homes on the hill. I walked with a group of people and had a certain air of confidence that night. I was going with a former college football player, former New York City probation officer, and a recently retired Green Beret. That's kind of an easy walk home to make. As I turned down the street to get to my apartment, they said, "Do you want us to go with you, or do you think you're okay?" I was about 100 yards away from home, and I said, "Oh, I'll just make it by myself." In Colombia, when you walk, especially at night, you do things like cross a street at a random point. In our family, if the light is green, we cross the street, no matter which way we go. So we'll end up zigzagging down streets, essentially, at the blocks, just in case anybody's following you. That was the first time in Bogota that I felt the need to do that. I crossed the street and walked on the other side of the street because I saw somebody on the side that I was originally on. As I walked by him, I noticed he was a security guard, but I still had a nervous feeling that I couldn't shake all night, even after I got home. About a quarter mile from my house that night, 3 of my friends picked up a taxi cab. As the second of them got off, 2 armed men got into the cab with my friend, and she was taken on what they call in Colombia the millionaire's ride. She was taken to a series of ATMs in order to take out the maximum amount of money that she could. She spent about 6 hours in this cab, not knowing if she was going to live or die. She spent this 6 hours listening to her captors debate between them what exactly they were going to do. Finally, reason among them ran its course, and they left her abandoned near the embassy, where she was able to walk and get help from one of the Marines. When I get up in the morning, I leave my apartment and lock a door. The door sends 4 pins into the wall, 1 up and 1 down, 1 into the floor and 1 into the ceiling. The door is bulletproof, and I get on a private elevator that has a key access. I leave my apartment and get picked up by an armored van, where I learned that the term riding shotgun really means somebody, because the guy in the passenger seat carries a submachine gun, just in case anything happens to us on the way to work. The only way to drive safely outside of Bogota, and this is even a new development, is to drive in a military-escorted caravan. My wife's Spanish teacher, Spanish classes are offered to anybody who wants them at the embassy. Has a beautiful farm in coffee country that's left unoccupied and is now destroyed because the Paras and Guerrillas, the opposing sides, left and right, have taken turns occupying it. And she knows that if she goes back, she'll be accused by one side of helping the other, whoever the current occupants of the building are, and she'll be killed by the opposite side. I had one visa applicant come, and he had another one of these strange hits, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. I asked him, what did you do? And he said that he had a customs violation. He was arrested for not declaring the money that he was taking into the U.S. If you take more than $10,000 into the United States, you have to report it. That's in cash or any way that you're carrying it. When I asked him how much he carried, he said that he carried about $120,000. I asked him if he got paid, and he said, really, I didn't get paid that much. I said, so you must have been doing this for a friend. He said, actually, I hardly knew the guy. He was just some guy in my neighborhood that asked me if I'd do this for him. Towards the end of another visa interview, I asked a woman who was looking to transit the United States and go to Spain to be with her husband why he lives in Madrid. The reason I was asking this question was just to give her grief and ask her why he wasn't living in Andalusia, where I served my mission in the south of Spain, which I think is a much nicer place. She said that he has to live in Spain because he can't live in the United States. When I ran a separate name check on him, I found out that he'd been a drug runner in a previous life. And finally, in my finest moment, I approved a visa for an elderly woman. When I ran the name checks, it came back clear. There was no problem. She didn't claim a husband, or she didn't claim to be widowed on her visa application, so I didn't run any name checks on him. A few weeks after I did this, we got a phone call from Diplomatic Security in Pennsylvania, and we got the facts saying that she had smuggled heroin in Milky Way bars to her husband, who was serving time in federal prison in the United States. Like I said, that really wasn't my finest hour. And that morning, I went through all our archives, making sure that it was actually a good visa issuance and that I had just gotten burnt by somebody who happened to be a good liar. Now, all these stories have been, I hope, have shown you a little bit about what I see every day in Colombia. I hope they've helped you understand it. But for us in the embassy community, there's one story that's sadder than any of these. There are currently 3 United States citizen hostages being held in Colombia. They were contractors working for the embassy, and they were taken by the FARC. One of the popular songs in Colombia by one of the most popular Latin pop stars is called Dreams. The first line in the song is that he dreams that there will be freedom for everybody who's kidnapped and held in the jungles of his country. Every day as I go into the embassy and walk through the heavy door, if you look to your left, you'll see that there's a picture of the president, the vice president, and the secretary of state. And below that on the table, there are 3 smaller pictures of our hostages who've been held for more than 3 years, with flowers that people donate. Every day, I walk by a living reminder that I do live in a dangerous place. I do live in a place that a lot of people don't want to go to. And with all that, I don't want you to think that Colombia is an awful place. I don't want you to think that you would never go there. The vast majority of Colombians are wonderful people. My family's been impressed by their spirits, their kindness, and their passion. We came back with T-shirts. We're here on vacation visiting my wife's family, her sisters and brother and their nephews, and my wife felt a strong obligation to buy T-shirts for the kids with Colombia's latest slogan for itself, that Colombia is passion. And that's something I've learned about the Colombian people and the Colombian culture, that it is passion, and it's passionate. In reality, I don't feel that threatened in the neighborhood I live in now. The apartment buildings I told you about that embassy employees live in are full now, except for the ones that are charging too much rent. And although I think a lot of my security is based on the armed guards and the big dogs that are stationed on the corners where I live, I think a lot of it goes to show that Colombia is improving in its situation. The current president of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, has done a lot for his country, and he's made a lot of these changes. He has a philosophy that everyone has a right to security and a responsibility to help provide that security. He's working with the United States and with his neighbors to help eradicate coca production. He's considered to be a great president and has put Colombia towards a path of peace and freedom. As I was starting in the Foreign Service and as I actually was being assigned to Colombia, a new law was passed saying that the president could run for re-election, which was a big deal. In Colombian politics, no president had ever been allowed to run for re-election in recent memory. When I got to Colombia, the law was finally approved by the Supreme Court, and Uribe was elected by a strong majority of voters without any direct support from a powerful political party. He garnered about 60% of the vote, which is a lot considering it was a 5-candidate race. Colombia and the United States have recently also agreed in principle to a free trade agreement. This agreement is going to let both sides grow and benefit each other. Colombia has a lot to offer to the United States in terms of materials and products that we can benefit from. And we have a lot to offer Colombia that they can benefit from. Our Consul General paid a visit recently on the north coast to a balloon factory that will be greatly benefited by this free trade agreement. This company is going to be able to sell their wares in the United States because of their lower costs. And hopefully the interchange between the two countries will allow Colombia to grow and to find the peace that it so richly deserves. Tourism is also gaining strength in Colombia. By a show of hands, how many of you would like to go to a country that has everything to offer you as far as vacation destination? It's close to where you live. You only have to change, if you live in Utah, you only have to change time by an hour or two, depending on whether it's daylight savings or not. It has great food, beautiful countryside, sophisticated cities, rainforests, mountains, the best service you'll ever have, and it's inexpensive. If you've thought about going to some place like this, to one of these tropical, mountainous, rainforest dreamlands, you've thought about going to Colombia. Well, it should be noted that there is still a travel warning that the State Department has issued for Colombia, and I agree with this travel warning, having traveled a bit. Colombia is a country with a lot to offer. A few years ago, Colombia started an internal tourism push under President Uribe. They started encouraging people in Colombia to travel within Colombia, to get to know their own country. They started with these caravans that have the armed military escorts to take the people, and now you can basically drive anywhere you want in Colombia. Citizens were encouraged to see their country and to get to know it. Recently, my parents came to visit us in Bogota, and we took our son to preschool. They had a conversation with the owner of the preschool, and she talked about how wonderful President Uribe is because now she can travel. Now she feels safe driving in her own country. My bishop told me that one of the great experiences he has living in Colombia is that he can drive from Bogota to Cali, and as you descend the mountains, you can see the change in the landscape and in the vegetation. And recently I spoke with a driver that picked me up at the airport, and he talked about the joy of driving from Bogota to Cartagena on the Caribbean coast, about seeing his country and about the pride he felt to be Colombian. Around Christmas time, or right after New Year's, there was an editorial in El Tiempo, which is a major Colombian newspaper, talking about this same drive and all that Colombia has to offer. The government has now made a switch, and they're now pushing international travel. They're starting to push for people to come to Colombia, and the port of Cartagena is opening to large cruise ships, and the red carpet is being laid out everywhere. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I think you should be doing. You need to get involved. As far as I see it, based on my remarks, the two things that you need to get involved in are the immigration debate that is hot in the United States and in the debate over international development. The first thing that you need to do is to inform yourself. You need to decide what feels right to you. Some people talk about building walls and criminalizing immigration violation. Others want amnesty. But most people don't really know what they think. Most people, it seems, think that illegal immigration is a bad thing, but they don't know how to deal with it. Most of these people, I feel, haven't taken the time or energy needed to decide what they feel is right. You should think about how you feel about development as well. Do you think that only large organizations should be involved in it? Or are you more in favor of microcredit? What role should the United States government play in development of other countries? What role should churches play? What role should nonprofit groups play, or for-profit groups? As you start to get informed, you can make the decisions about what you feel and how you feel things should start happening in the world. And I encourage you, once you've made up your mind, to spread your feelings and to learn what other people have to say. Like many people that come and talk to you, I'm not going to tell you exactly what my feelings are about immigration. That's mostly based on the fact that my job is to enforce the laws that we currently have. But I will say this. My job is to protect the borders of the United States, to facilitate travel, and to facilitate business. And I take these three responsibilities very seriously. I also take seriously that we're a nation of immigrants. When I was growing up, I thought that everyone had a grandmother with an accent. My relatively recent ancestors came from Ireland. And speaking candidly, they would have never returned to their home country. They came from nothing, and in one generation had children who were professionals. On a more personal note, and maybe a note that fits in a little bit more with our current immigration situation, I'd like to tell you about two of my colleagues. One was born in Mexico and moved to Texas at the age of 12. The other was born shortly after his family moved from Ciudad Juarez to El Paso, Texas. The move from Ciudad Juarez to El Paso really isn't that far. They literally moved across the river, but that move made all the difference in their life. Each of these two colleagues of mine have similar stories. One went to Harvard and the other went to MIT. Both worked for major management consulting companies, and both are now Foreign Service officers. I talked to one of them who had trouble with her security clearance. When she was being interviewed by the diplomatic security officer, they looked at her paperwork and said, "Why did you say that you're not a dual national?" And she was startled and looked back at him and said, "What do you mean, why didn't I say I'm a dual national? I'm not." He said, "You were born in Mexico, and by them you're still considered a Mexican citizen." She exclaimed that she raised her hand when she became a U.S. citizen and swore off all allegiances to other countries. She took that seriously and had no problem doing it. Things got worked out, by the way, and she actually has her job still. I do believe in the American dream, but I have to acknowledge that sometimes people can go about getting this dream in inappropriate ways. And hopefully we can find answers to these hard questions as people like you get involved in these debates. One thing that I loved about my time at BYU was the maturity and involvement of the students. Basically, the maturity and involvement of students who weren't me at the time. After graduation, I went to law school, and I went to a school that also had a large, relatively vibrant undergraduate community. When we were living in Boston, my wife and I, though, would always talk about how much more we liked BYU. And we couldn't put it together until we figured out that people at BYU were talking about and doing important things. People at BYU were volunteering to go with one of my professors to dig wells in Mexico, like some of my friends, to work for a summer in Mozambique. They were trying to make a difference. We miss that in our time, and sometimes still miss the feeling we had here at BYU. We miss the dedication of BYU students and faculty and their willingness to serve. Hopefully you will take the motto of enter to learn, go forth to serve seriously in whatever you endeavor to take up in your lives. Thank you. If you want, we can have a more formal question time now that I feel like the Prime Minister of Great Britain.
As you said in the last few years.
Thanks. You said that in the last few years that situations have improved in various ways in Colombia. You mentioned the upper scale apartment complexes are now full. They used to be empty and so forth. Mm-hmm. Has that led to a decrease in the number of false or illegal visa applications that you've noticed?
I think that the best way to answer that would be to give you a percentage of visas that we approve and reject, and that's something that we don't do in the State Department. Things are leveling off, though, as far as the number of applications go, but it's really, we still refuse a lot of people. I mean, it's still not Shangri-La. Things are getting better. They aren't perfect.
Can you tell us the percent of visas that you do reject? That is, if you have 100 clients, how many are typically going to be rejected?
We actually don't release our visa
I thought you might
statistics, but it's a lot higher than other countries.
Uh-huh.
It's a lot higher than... I mean, when I spent 3 weeks adjudicating visas in Buenos Aires, and it was amazing the difference in people that the numbers that you would accept or reject.
Another question. Years ago, I recall, 10, 12 years ago, Colombia had of all the Latin American countries, had the highest amount of U.S. foreign aid. And much of it was, of course, related to drug cartels and drug eradication. Is that still the case? Is Colombia still the country that receives the most U.S. foreign aid in Latin America?
I believe it is. And most of that money comes through Plan Colombia. which is specifically set out to eradicate drugs. If you go to the embassies in Latin America or anywhere in the world, you'll notice one thing about the embassy in Bogota is that it's humongous compared to them. We have a number of different buildings, and one of those buildings is occupied by our narcotics affairs section. And they have contractors out spraying chemicals. The U.S. government is buying helicopters for the Colombian National Police. We aren't doing inexpensive things for them. And we're also depending on how you count it, we're either the first, second, or third largest embassy in the world. So there's a lot of money flowing into Colombia from the United States to help get rid of drug production.
What else is foreign aid being used for besides drug eradication or cocaine eradication?
I'm not exactly sure because that's mainly what we focus on. I know that USAID is in Colombia. A lot of their efforts are being focused on crop replacement. That if you have somebody who's been growing coca, they're still going to be a farmer. They're still going to need a job. And how are you going to do that?
But they're never going to make as much as they could with raising coca. Yeah.
Hopefully, they won't get killed, though.
Right. Thank you.
Yep.
You mentioned what we could do to help the situation was become better informed. Do you have some advice to where we could start to gather information about immigration as well as international development?
I would start with the immigration debate. I think that one's easier. I would start watching the news. I think that's the easiest way to get informed. I'd probably look into USAID and see what they're doing as far as development goes. That might be a good place to start with them. But for the immigration debate, the advice I would give is to watch the news and see how you feel about it. What do you think about it? There was a recent editorial published, I think it was in the Arizona Republic, about LDS views of immigration. And it talks about how our views of immigration really don't fit with the way many people perceive us as more of a mainstream Republican organ or church. That a lot of what we have as far as views on immigration are a lot more forgiving. So I would start with watching the news. I would start with, you're in a great position that you can talk to professors about what they're doing. You can talk to people who work here at the Kennedy Center and find out what they think. What are they doing? And how do you feel about that?
I guess my question's regarding Cali. From what I'd read some years ago, the Cali was an armed camp almost, and now you don't seem to stress the drug-related tensions that go on there. Has it improved then from what it used to be?
I did kind of skirt the issue. If you read the travel warning that's been issued for Colombia, Colombia has a different travel warning than a lot of other countries. You read other countries and it says, well, don't go to Iraq. And it's pretty cut and dry. If you read the travel warning for Colombia, it says Colombia is not a great place, but it's getting better. You should feel free to go to Bogota, Medellin, and the cities on the North Coast, on the Caribbean coast. So there's that carve-out. There's another carve-out that specifically mentions Cali, that their Chamber of Commerce was very upset about and wanted me to change that afternoon. And anecdotally, when I was in Cali, I didn't see people running around with guns. But I don't know if any of you have ever... I used to travel to Savannah, Georgia a lot. I had a brother who lived there, and I've heard that New Orleans can be like this. And you just get a feeling of something goes on there that you don't know about. When I was in Cali, I had the feeling bad things happen here, a lot. And I hustled to get back to my hotel after dark. I have other friends who go and salsa the night away in Cali. But they say that you have to know where to go, and you have to go with somebody who's from there. So according to the State Department, and anecdotally according to me probably, Cali isn't the nicest city in the world. It's not the safest city in the world. It does have a lot to offer, but it still does have a very real danger element. I think that's it.